Hi there, and here we are at the Common Sensei number 3, and the theme for today is Life is an Emergence, not an emergency. So here's one of the great ironies of modern life. You would think that given the luxuries bestowed upon us by the capitalist system, our big salaries, fancy cars, high-tech gadgets, designer homes, that we'd be resting comfortably at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Saints or demigods floating on clouds of our own making, thinking mostly about actualization, which act of service will bring us ultimate fulfillment. Instead, the system that holds us afloat relies on tech that keeps getting bigger, faster, better. And to keep up, we find ourselves scrabbling from paycheck to paycheck, target to quarterly target, reporting cycle to reporting cycle, being churned ever faster with shorter horizons and increasing consequence. One wrong move, you feel, and you're back at the bottom. No wonder then that most people, most of the time, are on red alert, one wrong comma away from an amygdala hijack. No wonder we treat everything like it's an emergency. When facilitating corporate team performance workshops, I inevitably reference this, the amygdala hijack. I try to use humor to describe it. I say, your brain decides that if this bad thing happens, I'll get into trouble, I'll lose my job, my children will suffer, and I'll die. It raises the kind of laugh that tells me it touches a deep nerve. In fact, I once investigated this laughter response by interviewing people after one of those workshops, a couple of those workshops, and discovered that almost without exception, and even when they're not experiencing their work environment as chronically toxic or job insecurity is particularly high, they still had the thought process I had described, and more often than seemed reasonable. They shared that they often heard and even used phrases like, "It's not the end of the world," and "nobody will die," when they or somebody else overreacted. Importantly, those people also admitted that being in this state, I call it, rather prosaically, the red zone, prevented them from taking actions that they believed would be beneficial. For example, this fear of consequence prevented some from challenging a colleague in an open forum, others from challenging their leader even in a closed forum in a one-on-one meeting. For others, it led them to become unnecessarily angry when someone failed to meet a deadline, for fear that the missed deadline would impact their performance score and therefore their bonus, or their reputation and therefore their promotion. It led others to defend themselves aggressively when challenged, instead of taking the feedback constructively. In nearly all instances, the interviewees concurred that their fear-based actions could be described as defensive or treating the situation as if it's some kind of emergency. They also agreed that their reactions were not optimal for their mental well-being, nor for their own or their team's overall performance. The late business theorist Chris Argyris, who was also a Yale and Harvard professor and one of the recognized founders of the field of organization development, or OD, he pointed to what he termed defensive routines and attributed those to fear and threat. Peter Senge, another well-known leadership management theorist, elaborated on this idea and posited that these defensive routines are driven by the perceived, potentially damaging career consequences of revealing an error in one's thinking or of not knowing something. So it's not a rational response, it's based on a perceived consequence, not an actual consequence. In fact, when individuals learn to share their thinking and assumptions, they find that instead of being punished for doing so, they often build trust and get better results. So, 2 conclusions flow from the above. The first is that we are caught in a systemic cycle of our own making in which our competition for progress keeps us trapped in emergency mode, and we're barely able to enjoy the fruits of our genius. I'll address that, though, in a separate missive, in a separate video. The second is that much of what we fear, the emergencies we perceive to exist, are not always real. You'd know if they are, and there is a different way to respond. To be precise, there is a way to respond consciously and not react. So let's address that second point. And we'll do it by going through the exercise that I give to people to help them exit that emergency mode or the red zone when they recognize that they're in it. Usually it requires somebody else to point it out, but anyway. It's a presencing and grounding exercise taken from the practice of mindfulness. But please, don't discount it because you know mindfulness. I promise there's a surprise on this journey. I invite you to do it now. Just pause for a moment and look at the room around you and out the window if you can. Did you notice how still the objects are? How little attention they're paying to you and your thoughts, ideas, opinions. How little they care for what you want. Now look at that same space again, this time as if you're not in it. Stay where you are, but imagine you've gone to make a cup of tea and see if the walls or the windows or the furniture notice that you're missing. Now imagine that you didn't return from making that cup of tea. You discovered on the way that you'd won the lottery and you just ran out of the building and never came back. And imagine everybody joined you and nobody came back. What would happen to that room, to that building? Well, here's the answer. Something would happen in that space. Dust would gather. Batteries would run flat. Things would rust, peel, decay. Insects and rats would move in. Then some people might discover it, move in and clean it up, or have it demolished and build something in its place. The most important thing to notice is that it would happen without you, as life does. There's a whole world out there that has a life of its own and which does not need you. And I really stress that because that's the important point to get. To quote Carl Jung, all modern people assume that there is nothing that they have not made up. We think we have invented everything physical, that nothing would be done if we did not do it. For that is our basic idea, and it is an extraordinary assumption. Now, think of a problem you're facing in your life that you're trying to control. A concern you have for your country or political party. An issue at work. A relationship problem. Now imagine that you weren't going to be there to solve that problem the way you like. You're going to be captured by aliens and you'll only return in 5 years' time. What do you suppose will happen in that time? That's it. Something. Not nothing, which is what we more often assume. Things might turn out exactly as you'd hoped, despite you not being there. Perhaps, but let's not tell you, precisely because you're not there to interfere and treat it like an emergency. Or they might turn out differently, something unexpected, but better than anybody could have anticipated. Or it might be worse than anybody would have hoped, but with a silver lining. Even if the silver lining is learning to accept. The point is, something will happen in that space. And the stuff that happens without us, despite us, is what we might call emergence. When you really get this, you see that life is always emerging, that you are a part of that emergence, that you do not sit outside of life's events as their omniscient creator. We think we know what's best for almost every situation, and that it's all up to us, especially in the workplace, in the leadership context, and parenting and things like that. Yet how many times have you heard someone say some version of, "I wouldn't wish that situation on my worst enemy, but boy, it was good for me. It made me who I am today." That's emergence. That's life taking us on a journey that's good for us, not the one that we insist must happen, not the one that we hold on to and treat like an emergency. Now, if we were in a workshop setting together, we'd share examples at this point. I'd offer some of mine and ask you for some of yours. So see if you can think of some from your own life. And maybe ask the people around you for some examples from theirs. And armed with those examples, notice how, almost without fail, we only learn the lesson in retrospect, reluctantly, 10 years later. We're seldom present to the lesson while it happens. And that's the challenge, to become aware of emergence as it is happening. I equate this tiny point of awareness to the atom. It's the smallest particle, but it contains all the energy of the universe. Similarly, and this is logic, not some woo-woo, if it's true that life is bigger than you, and logically you can see that, and it's true that things happen without you and despite you, and you can see that, then When you open yourself up to allow for that, all the power of the universe becomes available to you. Many of us say we know this, we've done mindfulness, or we have it in our religion through expressions like let go and let God, or inshallah, or God willing. But do we really live it? It's kind of like going to yoga and knowing how to stretch. That must mean you're stretched for life, right? It's the consistent practice of it that matters. And then we think, oh, this is for the small, easy, inconsequential situations. But I tell my clients that those are the situations where you get to practice it. The small ones, the easy ones, where you get to gather evidence of your experience to prove yourself that it works and to calibrate your application of the principle so you don't go overboard. But if you really want to see the power of emergence, then develop your practice to the point where you can apply it in the biggest, most consequential situations. I was working with a pharmaceutical client during the COVID-19 pandemic. They had a big issue with vaccines, and the issue had potentially massive political consequences for them if it wasn't resolved in the right way. And the executive leadership team, who I was working with at the time, chose to apply this principle, to allow for emergence, to wait and see what happens. And the situation resolved itself. It took a little longer than they would have liked, but they acknowledged afterwards that if they had acted sooner or more aggressively, they could see how it might well have backfired and caused the exact consequences they had hoped to avoid. Some of the world's leading management and leadership gurus, being Peter Senge, who I referred to earlier, Otto Scharmer, Joseph Jaworski, and Betty Sue Flowers, have written about the advanced application of the emergence principle in a book called Presence. It's worth checking out. And finally, guess what? Emergence goes on all the time, all around you, right here, right now. If you're struggling to see it, well, it's the very thing you're fighting against. It's what you call problems. The stuff that needs to be fixed, changed, directed according to your will, perfected with technology or whatever other means are available. It's what John Lennon famously pointed to when he said, "Life is what happens while you're making other plans." Or the Yiddish saying, if you want God to laugh, tell him your plans. And that doesn't mean you don't have plans or make effort. It just means that you're not alone in the struggle to stay up there on your cloud. Thank you. If you found value from this, please remember to subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.